Good afternoon, and welcome to the third annual Kearns Global Business Lecture, featuring distinguished guests Edward Murphy and Dick Kearns. I'm Dr. Carol Fisher, Interim Dean of the School of Business, and I join Sister Margaret Carney, our president, in welcoming all of you to this prestigious event that has been made possible through the generosity and vision of Maureen and Dick Kearns. With 4 decades of professional experience in global markets, Dick Kearns understands that today's students must develop technical business knowledge along with cultural awareness and a global mindset in order to succeed and lead in the world marketplace. The Kearns Global Business Lecture Series was created with this educational objective in mind. This program brings industry leaders to campus to highlight diverse perspectives on global business matters. I want to welcome all of our students, faculty, and staff to this insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I especially want to welcome our community leaders to the St. Bonaventure campus. The university thanks you for joining us for this afternoon's program and for your continued partnership with the university. Some of our other special guests today include the wives of our speakers, Maureen, Mo Kearns, and Angela Murphy. Can you please stand? I also want to welcome some of the members of our School of Business Advisory Council, National Alumni Board, and University Board of Trustees. And I ask that you also stand and be recognized. And now for our keynote. St. Bonaventure welcomes Mr. Edward F. Murphy, who will be presenting Ethics Under Fire. Ed is a veteran financial and audit executive with more than 40 years' experience at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Coopers & Lybrand. Ed was elected to Zion Bank Corporation's Board of Directors in July 2014 and serves as a member of the Risk Oversight Committee and the Audit Committee. He also serves as the first mentor in residence at Pace University's Lubin School of Business. Ed holds a CPA and earned a Bachelor of Business Administration degree in 1974 from Pace University, where he has served as a trustee since 1997. Dick Kearns will serve as our moderator today. Dick began his career at Price Waterhouse in 1972 and was admitted to the partnership in 1984. Appointed leader of global partner affairs following the merger that created PricewaterhouseCoopers in 1998, Dick departed PwC in 2002 to join Zurich Insurance Group's senior management team in Switzerland. He continues to serve as a senior advisor for Zurich, as well as a director for its U.S. companies. Dick served on our Board of Trustees from 2000 to 2009. Along with Ed and Dick, I'm pleased to introduce our student panelists. Steve Aprolano, Larissa Tivadar, Andrew Pullman, and Sarah Hanno. Before I turn the program over to our moderator and panelists, I have a few housekeeping details to share. Our program will run for approximately 45 minutes, followed by question and answer period of approximately 30 minutes. Our student panelists will ask the first questions, and then for those in the audience, questions can be posed either in person or online. For in-person questions from the audience members, there will be 2 staff members coordinating the effort. You'll be asked to come forward to a microphone, one at a time, to pose your questions to the panel. Once you ask your question, you may return to your seat. You can also submit your questions online. There are instructions in the program, and I know that many of our students are familiar with this application, we're using Socrative. So to use this, if you have an internet-enabled device, cell phone is the most common one you might use. You can go to m.socrative.com, enter in the teacher's room code, which today is C. Fisher, SBU, and then you can just type in a question, and after you type in your question, you click on Submit Answer. That will allow us to collect some additional questions that we will pose to our panelists today. Finally, in addition to our campus audience today, we're joined by students, alumni, and friends from around the world as this program is being streamed live online. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel as they address Ethics Under Fire.
Thank you very much, Carol. Appreciate that great introduction, and welcome everyone. We love to play to a big room, so thank you. Thank you all for coming. This is the third year of our lecture series, and I think we've had some great success and a lot of fun with different venues, formats, and panelists. We've moved around quite a bit on campus too. This is in our third year, our third location, having started out on the Boblinier Court in the Riley Center, and then last year in the Regas Theater, and very appropriately for our guests Ed and Angela, now the Murphy Building. So we try to do everything we can to make our panelists feel happy. So Ed, welcome.
Oh, thank you.
To St. Bonaventure. As you heard in the introduction that Carol gave for Ed, he's had a very vast, very successful and exciting career in the different organizations he's worked for. After 9 years at Coopers and Lybrand, Ed joined the finance and accounting team at J.P. Morgan in the early 80s, at a time when the money center banks, as we called them in those days, were all investing heavily in growing their finance and accounting functions to deal with the great and rapid growth that the banks were going through. So Ed has dealt on the financial reporting side of issues. He became the principal accounting officer, the chief accounting officer of the registrant, which for those of you who know anything about the SEC, that's a very important job. He moved from there to be the head of internal audit globally for J.P. Morgan, and then moved to Japan, to Tokyo, to assume responsibilities as the COO of J.P. Morgan for their Asia-Pacific region. He then returned back to the U.S., worked on the merger of J.P. Morgan Chase, and was the CFO for one of their larger business units at the time he retired. But knowing Ed, and we've been friends for many years, retirement was not going to last very long, and he joined the Federal Reserve Bank in New York as CFO, not knowing at that time what lied ahead in the financial crisis, and then led the bank and its very complicated balance sheet through a very tumultuous period in that organization's history, and now is serving as a director of Zions Bank Corp, one of the larger regional banks in the U.S. So he will approach our topic today with a great deal of experience in the financial services industry, also with his global experience. In fact, a few months ago when we were talking about, when Ed agreed to come to participate, we got together to talk about topics and said, well, you know, what are the various things we might talk about? And I have to say the subject of ethics was first and foremost on Ed's mind, which leads us here today and to my first question, because Ed, obviously it was on the top of your list, so this is a subject matter that's of great personal importance to you. Kind of share a little bit with us on why it is so important.
Thank you, Dick, for that introduction. Before I answer your question, I first want to thank you, actually, for letting me be part of the Kearns Global Lecture Series. I think this is a really important and impressive effort that you've undertaken here, you and Mo. You've had some wonderful speakers, and the bar has been set really high, so I hope that we can actually meet that bar today. And I think that actually St. Bonaventure's is a pretty special place, too. Although I'm not a Bona, my brother is a Bona. Okay, my brother has his master's degree here. And just walking around the campus and meeting with some students this morning and some professors, it's a special place. So I hope that we can have a really good conversation about a very important topic today. And so thank you, Sister Margaret. Thank you, Dean Fisher, for letting me be part of making students, what's the thing, making them extraordinary. Okay, that's your mission, that's your motto. I hope we can make them more extraordinary on this subject today. So going to the question, why is it important? Yeah, I actually feel pretty passionate about this subject. From my own experiences as a parent, I have 2 grown children. And in speaking to students as a mentor, as Dick referred before, I mentor some students. I think it's actually sometimes difficult for students to make the transition from being in the classroom to the work environment. That they learn about ethics, they're taught ethics courses, but some of them think that it's only for the classroom. It doesn't really work in real life. And you hear expressions like, it's only wrong if you get caught. You eat what you kill, which is a famous line that you hear on Wall Street sometimes. Or you're not trying if you're not cheating, which was something that we heard on television on a few newscasts recently. And I want to really convey to students at every opportunity that in my experience of over 40 years, nothing can be further from the truth. Okay? That business is about building relationships. Relationships with the people that you work with, relationships with the people that you work for, relationships with the people that work for you, and importantly, relationships with your clients. And those relationships, to be successful, are built upon trust, are built upon integrity, and are built upon confidence that people will do what they say they're going to do in the most ethical way. And so if you're going to be a successful business or business person, this has to be at the core of how you operate. And so I think it's pretty urgent that we talk about this subject. The second reason I'm passionate about it, and it's something that you and I spoke about a few months ago, Dick, and that is that the regulators, particularly in the financial industry, but not only in the financial industry, are becoming more and more aggressive and being more and more fierce in how they're dealing with behaviors that are inappropriate. So, as an example, in October of last year, in New York City, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and it was a whole article in the Wall Street Journal recently that talked about this. So I'm not divulging things that are private and confidential. But the New York Fed summoned all of the heads of all of the major banks to their offices in Lower Manhattan. And they also brought in the FBI, the Justice Department, the Attorney General of New York State, District Attorney, and a number of academics. And they said to the heads of the businesses, while we respect all of you and we have confidence in your truth and your honesty and your integrity, we believe that it's not pervasive in your organizations. We believe that there's a lot of inappropriate behavior. And if you don't change that behavior, if you don't become more ethical and operate your businesses with more integrity, we're going to break you up. And we're going to throw you in jail. Okay? That was a big threat. Okay? And they were serious about it. And when I spoke to some former colleagues about that meeting, one of the things that they told me was one of the disappointments, the biggest disappointment coming out of the meeting was that both the CEOs and the business leaders and the academics said that they were most concerned that the most recent generation of workers, the millennials, didn't care. That they were much more relaxed in ignoring the ethical challenges that they were confronting every day in business. And so the question is, how do you deal with that? You know, how do you get to influence and change the mindset? And so that's why we came up and said, let's talk about it. You know, let's talk about it to the students of St. Bonaventure as a starting point, and begin that dialogue. And I know you take the classes in it, and I know you're doing it, and there's no accusations here, but just to really make sure that the dialogue keeps happening.
Obviously, given the stance that the Fed has taken, and some of the people that they invited to this roundtable, we're talking pretty high stakes here in terms of this is not a topic to be discussed in a rhetorical way. We're talking about being close to action taken on the part of regulators. But the financial services sector seems to get a lot of the ink in the newspaper and magazine articles or online blogs. But clearly it's not restricted to them, right? There are other industries are going through the same issue, and maybe you could talk a little bit about some of those other examples.
You're absolutely right, Dick. You know, I'm most familiar with the financial services industry, so I'll do a lot of reference in there, but I don't think it's limited to that at all. You know, if you look at, for instance, and I'm just going to use examples, not being accusatory or at all trying to pile on, but, you know, go to the press. General Motors, you know, had an ignition switch problem. And they didn't tell anybody. They didn't escalate it. They didn't recall, you know, until a number of deaths occurred. And then they found out that they knew about it all the while. You know, they knew about it all the while. You know, who was responsible? What was the ethical lapse that happened when somebody said, ignore it? Okay. If we look at big pharma, you know, the pharmaceutical companies, for the 3 years ended 2013, they paid over $11 billion in fines as a consequence of different unethical or criminal acts for advancing pharmaceuticals that, for purposes that they weren't tested for, or for knowing different side effects of drugs that they didn't tell people about. And I'll use you know, just one more that was closer to home, and that is in the construction industry. And again, there's lots of different ways you can have bad behavior there. But you know, I remember when they built Yankee Stadium not too long ago, they found that the construction firm that was doing the work there used subgrade concrete, not the specification, in order when they were laying the foundation for the stadium. That's why I'm a Met fan, by the way. I won't go to Yankee Stadium. But you know, it's not just the financial services. It's actually more widespread, these ethical lapses that you talk about and hear about.
Right. Yeah, it seems like it's not only a business problem, Ed, but really more of a societal lapse that's taking place here, and a much broader issue.
Well, you know, you raise an interesting question. So if you're really ethical and you say, so I don't want to go into the banking business, okay, and so I won't go into these other businesses, I'm going to go into not-for-profit or politics, right, because they're much more ethical. But, you know, just, again, some highlights, right? So the anchor on NBC, you know, nightly news, loses his job over, you know, unethical, stretching the truth on and making up stories about his own experiences. The Little League World Champions lose their title because they misrepresented, you know, where their players came from. Our New York State Assembly Speaker, you know, gets thrown out because of unethical behavior. Our Senate Majority Leader, you know, when confronted with quotes on how he was making accusations against other candidates, said, well, they didn't get elected, did they? You know, like the end justifies the means. And of course, one of my favorites, and this is the one that really stuck me, and it seems like a minor point, you know, the deflate gate, right, where they deflated the football. And that's where the sportscasters all say, well, if you're not cheating, you're not trying. I was appalled when repeatedly leaders, coaches, said that. What are you thinking? What are you telling people? It's wrong. But anyway, it's not limited to.
No, it's not, and it's certainly, it's obviously not a new problem either. But what is the trend? Is it the 24/7, cable news? Why does it seem to be? Is it more difficult to get away with things these days?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. Now, I'm not I didn't take a scientific poll, right? So I don't know with definitiveness, the answer to the question. But I'll tell you what I think. Okay, so one, there's been a couple of breakdowns in major, frameworks in our society. We can look at an impeachment of a president. We can look at, politicians. We can look at the Catholic Church. We can look at the Vatican Bank. We can look at a number of different, hallmarks in our society, and that starts to wear away at people, saying, "Gee, if this is happening in these institutions, what about me? Why am I the sucker, if you will?" I also think that the 24/7 news media and social media has the impact of wearing on people. If this is constantly what you're hearing and it's coming out instantaneously, and we can look at what's happened to the police department as a consequence of that as well. People say, well, it's what's expected. It's expected behavior. If I'm not cheating, okay, then I'm a sucker. I'm a loser. And I think that's a problem, because I think then people start to dismiss their own personal accountability for ensuring that the right thing is done every time. And I think, especially students, but just not students, everybody that's in this room and elsewhere should be thinking it's personal accountability, it's personal behavior that's important. And you have a value system, and you need to bring that value system to what you do, in the workplace, because it counts and it's important.
Let's stick with that a moment. We're all going to get some more insights into ethics and an ethics culture from you, Ed. We're all products of our own experiences, right? And tell us a little bit about how the organizations you worked for shaped your ethics compass, if you will.
You use that word compass, and I actually use compass a lot, moral compass. Does the person I'm dealing with and working with, speaking with, do they have a moral compass? Do they know right from wrong, and do they do the right thing? And I think, that it's really referring to what's your value system, how do you make decisions, how do you satisfy and meet commitments, and are you trustworthy and honest as you do things. And I've actually, as a father with my children, tried to, I tried to instill in them to understand where their compass was and how it should be pointing. Because there's going to be people that you work with or deal with that may try to steer the compass a different way. Okay? May try to cut corners, do things that are not necessarily straightforward. And you have to know where your compass is and how it points, so you know when it's not pointing in the right direction. Okay? And how you can take steps to make sure it points back in the right way. Because it's not, I talk, and we'll touch on this in a little bit, I talk about things being black and white. They're not black and white. And so you have to know when that compass, like when you're walking in the woods and the compass starts to turn, you have to know that's how these things happen, okay? And you have to know where that north is for you, okay? But going to my specific experiences, I actually have been, I think, fortunate, blessed, lucky, that I worked for 3 firms that I think valued at their bedrock highly ethical behavior and integrity in everything that they did. And so I'll do it in succession of my career. Coopers & Lybrand, that's the C in PwC now. And so they were a public accounting firm, and their main product was their opinion. their opinion on the financial statements that they certified. And they relied upon people having confidence in their opinion. And if people didn't have confidence in their opinion, then they didn't have any business. And so they instilled every step along the way the importance of integrity and importance of honesty in what you were doing. And I mentioned when I was a young intern at Cooperson Library, and I remember the head of HR coming in and speaking to all these naive people, and it's our first experiences with expense reports, right? That you're going to travel and fill out expense reports. And he said, you know, like, we really will reimburse you for every expense you incur. Even if they're lavish expenses and what have you, we want to make sure that you get reimbursed for doing our business. But if we find anybody cheating for 25 cents on their expense report, you'll be fired. That little anecdote has stayed with me for more than 40 years now. Okay, that it's not the amount. Okay, it's the fact that you cheated. Okay, and so it was really a pleasure to work in a firm that was consistent with my values. When I got to J.P. Morgan, J.P. Morgan had a very strong culture of integrity and ethics, and there were a number of different philosophies that were passed down from the very founders of the firm that stayed with me, that I used then and I use now. And one of them was that they would tolerate and learn from errors in judgment. That errors in judgment could be learned from, could be shaped. That judgment is shaped by experiences. And what I mean by that, an error in judgment, if a trader took a position and it lost, or extended a loan that went bad, you know, you would sit and learn and try to figure out how that happened and how can you avoid it in the future. But on the other hand, with respect to errors of principle, they were extremely intolerant. That with errors of principle, they would root it out and get rid of it. Okay, so if you made the loan and then didn't fess up to the fact that it was going bad, or if you had a trading book that had a loss and you started to cook the books or not mark it to market the way it should be. These are errors of principle. And as an internal auditor, the internal audit director, I use this principle a lot in determining, you know, when I got involved in different investigations and frauds and what have you, to determine when I would advocate for keeping somebody and learning and teaching them how to be better and making sure that that they were fired. And so it stayed with me, and I still actually use that as a background. And now at the Federal Reserve, you know, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, trust and integrity is like absolutely critical to their very being. The economy of this country is based upon the confidence that people have in the U.S. dollar. It's not backed by gold anymore. It's backed by the faith of the U.S. government, and in that, the Federal Reserve. Same thing with you know, overseas. You know, the financial system from the FOMC perspective, as well as how they supervise banks. And so they need to have the faith and confidence of everybody. And I remember, you know, 10 years ago when I was sitting in their offices, and I decided that I would accept the position that they offered me. They said, wait 1 second, and I sat in the office, and two people came in, their ethics officers, came in and spent the next hour or two explaining to me the importance of the role I just had taken, and the importance of my behavior ethically and with integrity, not only within the Federal Reserve and the walls from 9 to 5, but in everything I did, because I represented the Fed, and everybody has to have confidence in what the Fed does. So I was really blessed, and I say I'm blessed and lucky, but actually it may actually be more than that, because when I looked at all these three firms, I looked at what their value systems were. I looked at their annual reports. I talked to the people when I interviewed with them to try to distinguish with whether things were, you know, words or whether they actually were part of the fabric of the organization. And so it is part of you know, a choosing experience as well, not just lucky.
Okay. So now So that was your career on the management side. Now you're an independent director for a very large bank. How important are ethics now in your governance view of the world versus the management side?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I think there's two aspects to that question. One, since you're a director, you're not actually in the day-to-day. You don't really know what's going on. You don't know what's happening on the ground. And so you really have to have reliance upon the management and the chairman and the rest of the board to be ethical, that they're telling you the truthful things, they're doing the right stuff. And so I did a lot of research with respect to that company and that company's board in particular and president to see, you know, what were their values and how did they reinforce them in their day-to-day work, and I was very, very satisfied with that. But beyond that, as a director, whether it would be this company or any other company, I think the role of the director is to make sure that, in fact, that the right thing is happening, that there is a code of ethics, there is a code of conduct, that there is monitoring taking place, that there is a whole framework and system that's supporting a way of doing business.
Okay. Stick with that concept about the different systems. How do companies, organizations go about establishing a culture of ethics? How do they sustain it? How do they improve it? How do they build on it? What are some of the things that you've seen that work?
Yeah, and I'm sure that what I say is not rocket science, but you know, the first and foremost, and you hear this, is it's the tone at the top. It starts with the chairman and goes to the chairman's management team. They have to walk the talk. Okay, they have to behave like they mean it. That integrity is important. That ethics are important. And so that's the first thing. And that's just not in a 9-to-5 basis. That's in how they conduct themselves all the time. Because you know, ethics and integrity is not something you leave behind when you go home, okay? And you operate in your community. It's a value system. And so you have to first make sure that you're walking the talk and you're setting the tone at the top. The second is to make sure the firm has articulated what is expected, what behavior is expected of the people that work for them. And they do that by their mission statements, their value statements that usually get published, their code of ethics, their code of conduct. Okay, all of these are part of a company's culture, particularly big companies. And you can, you know, if you look on websites, they all have them. But then it goes beyond just having them written. Then it goes to how do you make sure that they actually are executed. And the third, I'd say, is to make sure you can hire the right employees. That when you're actually screening people and interviewing them, you're looking for, like, what type of person is this? You know, do they have the values that, you know, will reflect what this firm stands for? And you know, there's a lot of different ways of doing that. Looking and asking people, you know, how they make decisions. What decisions did they make? What was the most difficult value issue that they had to deal with? From a student's perspective and a prospective employee, you know, it's asking the same thing of the company, by the way, of like, you know, how do you make decisions and what values do you have? The fourth is for me is to make sure that you have the channels open for employees to report when unethical behavior is occurring. So there's a lot of you know, whistleblower hotlines. Mm-hmm. There's emails. There's open door policies. There's ombudsman programs at the Fed. We had all of those. Okay, and making sure that those happen. But now that just gives you the ability to do it. The last thing that makes an effective company is that they're actually monitoring it and reporting it. And so I have a board meeting tomorrow, you know, and I'm on the audit committee, and I will get a report tomorrow that says here's the status of our whistleblower and hotline, you know, communications. This is what's come in the last quarter. This is the nature of them. This is how we're investigating. These are the things you should be aware of. And so you want to make sure that it's alive and that it's happening. And I'd say that the last thing, okay, is that you need to make obvious and reward people for coming forward with mistakes. Okay, not be punishing them and shooting them so that people go and hide and they never want to report the mistakes, but they actually get rewarded for raising them. What would the difference have been for, let's say, a GM had there been a reward system that said, let us know when you have an ignition problem, because that's part of what we want to do. So it's rewarding the errors, people reporting them. And when you get the errors of principle, making it obvious that there was an error of principle and making the punishment known. I become a proponent of execution in the public square, is what I call it.
There you go. Everybody loves a hanging.
Yeah. And Jack Welch was a big one at GE. That way you knew that you were reinforcing the behavior that you wanted to have.
Ed, let's talk a little bit about, in business as in life, things are not always black and white. In fact, they're often gray. What are some ways to navigate through the gray stuff?
Excellent. As I said before, the compass, when it moves, it goes back and forth, and sometimes you don't even realize it when you're going down too far in one direction. And so it is gray. It's not black and white, and I don't want anybody, particularly our students, to think that it's easy to determine what this is all about. And as an example, let's take the financial services industry, and the financial crisis that occurred, and people say, it's all those banks that did all these things wrong. And if you look at the food chain of the financial services, let's start with mortgages and say, well, is it the people that fill out the mortgage with the misinformation, on their income and their assets? Is that ethical or unethical? Was it the mortgage banker that actually accepted the application and didn't verify? We have no docs required on mortgages. Or was it the investment banker that took all the mortgages and packaged them and said, it's okay. We don't want to know what's in there. We'll just package them. As long as there's a buyer, it's okay to move these mortgages on. Or the government that said everybody should have a house, and we'll guarantee these mortgages regardless of whether there's sufficient collateral and income to support them. Or was it the rating agencies that rated them AAA without really digging in and understanding what was supporting the securities that were made up of these mortgages? Or further, was it the pension fund that bought them because it's AAA? This is good stuff. This is AAA. We don't have to worry about it. Where was the ethical piece along that continuum? And so, or was it the regulators that said, we're not going to crash the party here because everybody knows this is stupid, and the government thought that the free market would calibrate the mortgage bankers the right way, and so we don't have to stop people. So there's a number of different lapses that may go beyond judgment, that could go to ethics and integrity, all along the way, and so it becomes really gray. And that's a whole lot of people that were involved there. So it wasn't obvious to almost anybody along that food chain of what was happening. But I have to say, going forward, like, how do you deal with that? And I've been confronted, and I'm sure you have, Dick, as well, with situations where it just doesn't feel right. You're involved and you're doing business, and sometimes it's your boss that's telling you what to do, and you say it just doesn't feel right. So what do you do? And I think that the first thing is to make sure you understand all the details and understand the judgment that they're exercising, and sit down with your boss or the people involved and say, could you help me understand? Because I don't feel comfortable with what's going on. And maybe based upon all the facts, your opinion, you become more comfortable and your opinion changes. Or maybe it doesn't. In which case, then, how do you escalate it? To get more facts or to get better acceptance, and going to other people, going to HR, going to legal counsel, picking up the whistleblower hotline, and doing things like that are all ways of dealing with things that don't make you comfortable. Because that's kind of it, when you start doing things that are contrary to your value system, and it's important. And it reminds me of, when you go in New York City, they have these advertisements that show the package on the subway that says, if you see something, say something. Okay? And that's what this is all about, is if you see something, say something. It may be just an empty box. Okay? But you need to make sure that you just don't ignore it and things go on the way they are.
One last question for you, and then we'll get to the panel. We were talking this morning, you had mentioned that the J.P. Morgan annual meeting, they had announced that they were going to be hiring 8,000 people into the compliance side of the business. That's a pretty incredible number. Companies are spending a lot of money in this area, setting up the kind of systems you've referred to. Are we making progress?
Well, until it's zero, you haven't made enough progress, right? And by the way, just to correct, it was in the J.P. Morgan annual report where they said they actually hired 8,000 people in 2014.
Already did. Okay.
That's kind of the response to what the Fed said, you better get your act together, right? And they spent a whole page saying this is how we're reinforcing our code of behavior. And one of the other quotes or philosophies that J.P. Morgan passed down that he testified before the Senate in 1933 said, I believe and we believe in doing first-class business, and that in a first-class way. And in the annual letter, they actually reiterated that's what our motto is. That's what we want to get to. So they're really paying attention. But the good news is, and I was reading this article from the National Business Ethics Survey of the U.S. workforce, and it's from 2013, and it said the survey noted that as a percentage, workers observing misconduct in the workplace was 41% in 2013, which was down from 45% in 2011 and down from 55% in 2007. So that's a really good trend. But again, it's something that is really still kind of shocking, right? That you need to continue to pay attention to. And if you don't, the government is going to get more fierce. They're going to make sure it gets corrected. But I think the point I want to re-emphasize here is that as you look at this, it's really personal. At least it's personal for me. And I always remember my mom saying, if everybody jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge, would you do that? Now, of course not. And that's so. As everybody is being unethical, should you? And the answer is no. And I sort of made that for my career, and I didn't start that way, but sort of evolved to it that I wanted my brand, what I was known for, what my reputation was to be one of integrity and honesty. And so that when I expressed an opinion as an auditor or as a financial person, people didn't say, why did he say that? Why has he disagreed with me? Is he after my job? Is he trying to undermine my position? But because I disagreed and it was fact-based. And now, I have to say, I wasn't always right. Okay. But it wasn't because I had a question of integrity or ethics. Okay. And again, that was a key part of why they asked me to be the auditor and why I think it was a pretty successful assignment.
Okay. Very high stakes, this whole topic, and obviously one in which we all can control our destiny, as you said at the end, Ed. What do you want your brand to be? How do you want people to think of you? And that's something that you take with you not only when you leave St. Bonaventure, but you take it through your entire career, and you either build on that or you don't. And we all control our own destiny in that regard. Let's move to the panel for some questions. And Steve, we're going to start on your end of the table and fire away.
Okay, sounds good. So you touched a little bit on how a company establishes a culture of ethics, but how does a company with a culture of non-ethical behavior extinguish that, and can they come back from that?
I think that my experience is that it depends on what the head of the institution is doing. Okay, you can change if you change the tone at the top, and sometimes that takes actually changing the top, and you reinforce what's happening throughout the organization from top to bottom. You can, but it's very hard. It's very hard. Sometimes you lose a lot of money doing it. Okay, you just can't, but I got all these clients, I have all these contracts. Who cares if I got them, in a underhanded way? And you really need to re-engineer the whole process and what have you to do that. It can be done, but I have to say it's hard. A lot of times what happens is companies get merged, and a new culture starts to take over, and they push out the old culture.
My question is, what are some challenges in regards to ethics and culture when it comes to working abroad?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Thank you for bringing it up. Working abroad, you have a number of things. You talk about culture, right? Corporate culture. Well, you're in a different societal culture. And I have to say, from the corporate side, we expected the same cultural behavior and ethical behavior and integrity in our overseas offices as we did in the United States. And some of that is because that's who we wanted to be, and some of that is because the U.S. government, by passing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the last 70s, said you better make sure that what's happening overseas is consistent with what the standards are here in the U.S. And so it was really easy for me to take the corporate mantra to Asia. Where it started to get a little bit difficult was when you dealt with different social issues, particularly around diversity. In some Asian cultures, for instance, the position of women in business is not very well appreciated or supported. It's a male-dominated sort of culture, and yet in the U.S. we have diversity, and we want to make sure everybody has the opportunity to succeed, and we want to make sure that people are giving lots of opportunities. And so we had to really work within our offices to make sure that we broke that down and enforced our diversity objectives. And that was not easy. There's cultures in, before I went out, I thought Asia was Asia, right? But Asia is a lot of countries with a lot of different cultures and a lot of different attitudes toward each other. And so it was more difficult than I thought. And then when you dealt with clients, it didn't change when you got outside. The clients were like that, and they wanted to only deal with men, and so, in reinforcing and saying, well, we have a team here, and she does just fine, and she's our person, is really, some of the stuff we had to deal with. So you had to be sensitive and recognize it, and then work for what you wanted, what the company stood for, and what you wanted to make sure happened.
Yeah, I think, Larissa, one of the keys there, right, is that when you work abroad, look at global. There's never usually a global solution, right? So you have to go into all these different areas of the world and adapt somehow when you're trying to implement and sustain these policies, that you take whatever those local culture issues are into account. And as Ed said, they can be very challenging. Andrew, let's move to you.
People often talk about the idea that banks have kind of a too big to fail mentality, and that there's a moral hazard created by the belief that even if they engage in risky behavior, that the government will come and bail them out. would you say that you believe that this mentality actually exists on Wall Street and in some other larger companies? And if it does, why haven't big banks already been split up?
I think that that's an interesting observation. I never, in my personal experience, felt like people were operating that we had this huge safety net, so who cares? We'll take on more risk and the government will bail us out. I never thought that, or saw it, or witnessed it, when I was at the Fed. In certain instances, I would say that, if you look at some institutions, if they got bailed out, it wasn't because they were trying to save the firm, but trying to save the people who had invested in it. And I don't mean invested in equity, but had deposits, had insurance policies, etc. Now, the government itself, through legislation, the Dodd-Frank Act in particular, has really worked hard with its stress testing, with its capital allocations, with its rules and what have you, to try to make sure that the banks that are the biggest, in particular the largest ones, have enough capital, have the culture, have the controls. That's why they came and talked to them and said, we know you have capital, we know you have risk systems, we know you have the right talent, and now you better make sure you have the right attitude. And so that's really something that they're pushing hard to make sure that they won't do it.
Yep, I think the answer is stay tuned. Sarah?
I know you talked a lot about how you're fortunate to work for companies with strong ethics. Can you discuss personally what the biggest ethics-related challenge you faced?
It's kind of interesting. Dick and I were speaking about this earlier. And interestingly, we were struggling to come up with things that really pushed us to our end, and which sounds kind of weird, right? But if you have, to me, my children call me black and white. I call myself Gumby. Okay, I'm so flexible. But if you have a decision making, it doesn't be and a process, and where you can go wrong, and whether you're going to leave the institution or not. It isn't that hard. But I will say that there was a few times I had one of my best friends at J.P. Morgan ran a major operation at Morgan, and we did an audit of them, and we gave them a failing audit grade. Which was quite severe. You had to go before the audit committee, and you didn't get more than one failing audit grade. And so the question was, was I actually going to give my friend, my dearest friend, a failing audit grade? And it's sort of like, it's just business type of thing. And yes, we did. His wife didn't speak to me for quite some time. But what was the interest of the shareholder, and what was the right thing to do, and what was it that was expected? And I have to tell you that my friend was not upset, and explained to his wife that I screwed up, and Ed's job is to do this, and that's what we have to do, so that was a bit of a stressful time for me, and it actually was reinforcing to have a friend who shared my values, that was not taking any retribution on it. By the way, he's still my friend. Dick, you must have had some though too.
Yeah, I would say I wouldn't point to a particular incident like that, but Sarah, I would say the challenge for me working in Europe in a Swiss environment, where people spoke English very well, and so it was very easy to communicate with people who would then nod back and say they understood, but what I started to learn over a period of actually working in the culture there, that while they understood the words, the context wasn't always what you would think it would be. And so you could be easily lulled into saying, okay, they get it, let's move on. In the whole area of transparency, as an example, think of I was in the insurance business in Switzerland, not banking, but when you think about the whole idea of transparency, in Switzerland, there was none, and that was their product that they had to sell. That was their differentiator. So to come in and expect people to act in a way where you're taking away their advantage was a struggle because they talked great English, but they thought very differently. And so you had to go back and forth, and repeat and repeat and repeat and try to figure out a way to get sustained behavior where they really knew what you were trying to do, because they're raised differently, had different mindset towards things, and language could be, a false comfort that people would get. So I think in this whole area, it's really trying to keep an open mind and being able to talk to people consistently about it. It's sort of like a CEO goes out and talks about strategy to their employees. They write it out well. They've got all the right sort of websites and pamphlets and buzz lines, but you have to talk about it all the time, because if you don't reinforce it, people are going to move to the left, move to the right, and you think you're on strategy because you have all the things in place, but people aren't, walking the talk. We had this discussion before too. Ed's mother's phrase of "Would you jump off the Brooklyn Bridge?" Right? And my favorite one is "Talk is cheap, money buys whiskey." So if you're not seeing that done all the time, you can get lulled into a false set of comfort. And I think that's the problem that we've seen, and why, going back to some of Ed's early comments back to October, the regulators are saying enough of the talk, and showing positive trends that we're getting better is not good enough. And so we either solve this problem for ourselves, or someone's going to solve it for us, and that usually isn't the most efficient or best way to accomplish the goal. Right? Carol?
Well, we have quite a few questions that have been submitted via Socrative, and people can continue to do that if you would like to. But I also want to invite people to come down to the microphones. We have Monica Mattioli manning one microphone and Joe Flanagan the other. I'll ask one of the questions that's been sent in, and while I'm doing that, please, if you have a question you would like to pose, feel free to come up to one of these microphones so that you can do that. We've had quite a few questions submitted dealing with the role of corporations. So I'll tell you one of those questions. It started by noting that recent Supreme Court rulings have made corporations persons for free speech purposes. And the question is, do you agree with this? Should companies be treated more like persons when they have violated laws?
Yeah, I think that, my law course way back when said that for legal purposes, corporations are considered people. And I think the answer is that, yeah. I reflect back to the early part of this century when Enron, which was one of the biggest scandals that took place at that point in time, had lots of different things wrong with it, and they threw a few people in jail. The company was merged and went out of business to the point of before the question. But one of the other fatalities in that was Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen was a public accounting firm that issued audited financial statements. But because as part of the investigation, when they said, the Justice Department said, we're going to come and investigate to see how you came to this opinion, they destroyed the records. Okay? Error of principle. They went out of business. The Justice Department shut them down. Okay? And I think that that's sort of the message that I think the Fed gave to the banks in October, is that they will not tolerate corrupt behavior or a pattern of corruption within organizations, and I think that's right. I do believe that's right.
I think in that sense too, that if the idea is that corporations should be treated as people and punished, there were two very large entities where the employees not only lost their jobs, they lost their pensions, and I think at least in terms of perhaps Arthur Andersen being the bigger victim than Enron, that personal opinion, that they probably let that unwind too quickly, because I'm not necessarily sure that everybody in that organization should have been punished for the actions of a few, but they were. So I think in that sense, what we're seeing now, and maybe the same thing is true of Lehman Brothers.
That's right.
People. So I think that in fact that is happening.
Okay, good. I think we have an audience question over here.
All right, so my question is, with financial profit being so important to the heads of companies, how do you get people to think more on the basis of the triple bottom line rather than just on the basis of financial profit of the company?
There's I think the best run companies think about profit, and it's one of the important things that you have to do. But you have a number of stakeholders in the environment, right? Every organization has at least three stakeholders, maybe four. One is the shareholder, okay, which is looking for maximum profits. Two is the employee, who needs to be treated with respect and treated with fairness, so that they come to work every day and want to do the right thing for the organization. The third is the customer. The customer has to have a product that they want to buy. And actually, I'll say the fourth, the community that you're operating in. And so making sure that the environmental aspects of what you're doing are appropriate, and how you're supporting the community are appropriate. And if you don't have that in balance, if you just focus on profits and the other elements go away, you're not going to be in business that long. And so I think that I'm a free market type of a person more than I am having the government control you. Once the government has to come in and control and do these things, then that's not going to be a happy ending. But if you let the markets influence you more and have that in balance, if you're not treating your people right, you're not going to get good people, you're not going to make good products, you're not going to satisfy your customers. So you have to make sure that all those stay in balance all the time. I don't know if that answers your question, but to me that's how I always looked at the business. It's not just maximizing profits; it's the long-term sustainability of the corporation.
Okay.
Really, Chris,
Do we have someone back there? Yeah.
I've never been accused of needing a mic.
how are you, Chris?
Hi, good afternoon. I believe you mentioned at PwC earlier that if you cheated on your expense reports for a nickel, you were fired. Did I hear that correctly?
Big picture, 25 cents, he said.
25 cents at Coopers and Lybrand.
Okay. That was a corporate policy, right?
Yeah, that was the philosophy. Yeah.
Okay. So, and I teach at another university, and there's cheating problems there. There's cheating problems here. Many universities have cheating problems. Currently, and I don't know about this university, the decision of how to deal with cheating lies with the professor based on syllabus, etc. And there seems to be a challenge to universities that should there be a policy, in your view, to prepare kids for the real world, a university-wide policy that says if you cheat, you either fail or you're thrown out, a universal kind of ethics standard for a school, so the decision of how to deal with someone who's unethical in the classroom is kind of taken out of the professor's hands and left to the university as a whole.
Carol, you want to answer that one?
Maybe for the people that are on the streaming video, we can maybe paraphrase sort of the question, because while we heard you for sure, I'm not sure that the people that are getting the streaming heard it. And the question was from one of a professor at another school that said, you know, the decision of what to do with students that cheat is left to the discretion of the professor, and so you have different standards or actions taken, ranging from admonition to a failure to dismissal or being thrown out of school. And shouldn't it be really a corporate-wide or university-wide program or decision, right? Policies. That was the. And what's our reaction to that? Is that's sort of the question? Okay. You know, I think it's like any organization. Is what is it that you want to instill? What's the behavior that you expect? What's the behavior that the corporation expects? What's the behavior that the university expects? What does it want to tolerate? And I think creating the standards that are expected of the students and of the professors, for that matter, should be clear, and not be you know, varied from class to class, because that sends different messages to students, and they don't know how to behave. And it also, you know, we used different examples. This is another one of those black and white. You know, if I cheat on the exam and by getting last year's exam, you know, and having the answers, is that really cheating? You know, that was always a tough one for me. You know, I said it was the professor's fault for not changing the test. You know, it's not my fault for having the answers. So, you know, is that wrong or not? And it's sort of the same question of, you know, if you go over the speed limit and so you're breaking the law, is that ethical or not ethical? You know, and so there's different ranges here that you have to sort of define. And when you start defining them, you can start to see where the line starts to get crossed. But I think it helps. It helps the, you know, it's like if I go to a corporation and say, you know, different departments do different things. Well, how do the employees know what to do if every department's doing something different? It becomes really difficult. And so you get the standards and policies they can put in place. I think it makes better sense. That's my opinion.
Excellent. I think we could have a whole forum on that particular topic. But we've got another question here from the audience.
I am Dr. Al-Humadi, physician. I enjoyed your lecture very much and the panel. You know, we deal on individual basis with life and death as physician, and we have a lot of rule and regulation in our industry. Especially, I have been practicing for 40 years, and within the last 20 years we have a lot of things that we really have to go by, and we go by the ethics standard. The financial situation, I mean, is different. You are dealing with a broader finance of people who depend their livelihood on the Wall Street market. And when the Wall Street market crashed, it hurt a lot of people. My question is this. I mean, what did lead to this breakdown of ethics? Is it lack of rule regulation? Is it lack of moral ethical standard personally? Or is it lack of fear from being punished? I am so glad the Fed went down and brought these big boys in the stock market and talked to them. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, it's a great question. What happened? You know, and it's like that compass that moves slowly. You know, I don't know what would happen, but over time, over time, the control systems that were put in place to monitor risk-taking and monitor, asset quality, either broke down or were ignored. If everybody else is doing it, gee, I saw this happen in one case where in the mortgage business, they went to the regulators and said, listen, there's this other institution that is extending mortgages that are just not right, and they're doing it at breakneck speed. They're making a fortune. They're hiring all of our best people. They're paying them big bonuses, and how do we keep up? And I was the CFO of that business. They're saying, we want to take more risk. I said, no, you don't. And so how do you balance that? And so that starts the wave. I think in some cases, banks in particular forgot who their clients were. Was it the person extending, asking for the mortgage, or was it the pension plan that was buying their securities? And did they really have the client's best interest, in mind when they were doing these things? They're all their clients, and they were getting rewarded because they were getting profits, and they were making profits, and so that was all their driving. If I can, the words eat what you kill. If I make money now, who cares? If it goes bad next year. So now you see a lot of different things in compensation, what they call clawbacks. The federal regulation required clawbacks in all compensation plans now, so that if in 2 years things go bad and you got paid for them this year, you owe us money back. And so they're looking for balances, but again, you can't really regulate it. Then people start arbitraging all the laws, like what does clawback mean? But I think there's a whole series of things that happened over time that are really disappointing and shouldn't have happened.
Things were in place, but too many parts of the links were weak, and the scary thing about that is that it means it could happen again, and that's why I think it's so important for this topic to remain very much in the forefront, because if we're not talking about it, it could happen again. And we saw it happen in, as unfortunate as it was here, you go to Europe and some of the economies there it will take 15, 20 more years for them to recover. And so we have to be sure that we're more vigilant to make certain this time, and it's not going to happen by more government regulation or quasi government regulation. It happens with all of us. It happens with all the organizations that we work for doing the right thing at the right time because it's the right thing to do. It's going to be unfortunate if that happens. I agree with that. I think there, in fact, one of the main things that probably doesn't get talked about enough were changes in compensation systems that came out of this, where these traders in that mentality were dealing with incredible personal wealth issues with other people's money, and I think a lot of that governance has been put in place to discourage that kind of radical behavior. But if it happens over time, that's a whole other issue.
All right. Well, I think we've discussed a number of very, very interesting and important issues today. I'll ask everyone to please join me in giving our moderator and our panelists another round of applause.
Thank you very much.
On behalf of our president, Sister Margaret Carney, our provost, Dr. Michael Fisher, the School of Business faculty and students, and our alumni and friends the world over, thank you very much for your extraordinary insights and guidance. I know our students and other friends in the audience will welcome the opportunity to interact with you further during the reception. I also want to assure those of you who submitted questions via Socrative that I will present those questions to our panelists so that they can be thinking about those issues. If you would like to relive today's experience, the entire program will be available on our website. So you can go to www.sbu.edu/Kearns Lecture. This is the third successful Kearns Global Lecture Series, and we look forward to future opportunities for enlightenment through the engagement and generosity of Mo and Dick Kearns and the Kearns Global Business Lecture Series. Thank you very much, and I invite all of you to join us for a short reception in the Foster Pavilion of the William E. and Ann L. Swan Business Center. Thank you.